So, welcome back to what will almost certainly be the last of these knockout tourneys that we do, because the only unit type that we haven't really done, aside from the one that you're about to see, is archers, and I would need to enlist the help of some poor soul to help me do that, I think, because the AI certainly would not play ball when it comes to trying to smash two units of archers together in the same way that they do when it comes to pure melee units. So I think we'll be giving that one a miss, at least in terms of this patch. If this is the sort of video that people want to see more of in the future in the new patch, after we've done stuff like faction overviews and such, maybe it can make a little bit of a return then. But for now, at the very least, this is going to be the conclusion to this little mini-series. And speaking of units not exactly playing ball, this is probably the one that was the funkiest to run in terms of mechanics. You'll see what I mean a little bit when we see some of the units face off against one another, in the sense that there's a lot more static units when the units are fighting one another, and it's a little bit weird, and it wasn't the sort of thing that I could really do much about without interfering with the results of the fight. Something else to bear in mind as well is this is the one that I think RNG was having a bigger say in this particular unit type than in any of the others that we've seen so far, mainly because running this test again, with a couple of notable exceptions on some of the units just for my own curiosity, led to different results each time. And based on the unit that went on to win this tournament, and based on some of the things that I learnt afterwards, yeah, really pretty much 6 out of the 8 units I feel like that were involved in this one could have actually gone on to win the tournament overall. And really the overall structure of the tournament wouldn't really have changed all that much. So the initial seeding played a little bit of a role, but ultimately RNG was the thing. Also, only 8 units in this one. Now, there weren't enough in terms of different factions having melee cavalry units to fill out a whole roster of 16. And even if there were, the vast majority of the 8 to 16 category, in fact all of them, would have been single HP cavalry, and it would have made the first round completely pointless to run anyway, because all of those single HP cavalry units would have been utterly wiped out by all of these multiple HP cavalry units. So we will be seeing these units that you see before you. The one that I decided to rank at 1, which the seeds, of course, as with the other tournaments, are based entirely upon my own biases and perceptions, based on what I've seen throughout battle replays over the course of the past year and a half. So the champions of the White Hand were the ones I rated as my favourites to go on to win the tournament, because I felt like the extra damage that they do, real cavalry killers in real battle situations, as we've seen before. So I felt like even though they maybe lack a little bit in terms of defence, they don't have a shield, for example, but that's not really a factor when it comes down to pure melee combat such as this. So I gave them a little bit more of an edge. The 2 units at the bottom as well, Pharazim Nobles, which have got a little bit more of a focus around charging and acting as a sort of auxiliary shock cavalry, more so than pure melee cav, even though they do wield that sword. And the Nurad Windblades, which I felt were a little bit more mobility focused with their enhanced speed, but maybe more lightweight nature. So you can see where my biases and perceptions lay at the start of this tournament at the very least. But let's crack on with the opening battle, which is going to see the first ranked champions of the White Hand take on the 8th ranked Pharazim Nobles. So the opening fight here is going to be the champions of the White Hand taking on the Pharazim Nobles of Numenor. And you may be wondering why the Pharazim Nobles are down here in 8th, and that is because they are billed as being maybe a little bit more of a hybridized unit, in the sense that they have a better charge bonus. And indeed, they do end up performing a little bit better in non-sword cavalry or non-melee cavalry roles, which is why I decided to put them a little bit lower down on the list in comparison to all of the others, which are much more focused around being that all-out melee cavalry unit. And in the end, that did end up paying out here. You see the champions of the White Hand did go on to be victorious, though again a close run affair. I do feel as though it's one of those situations where if you were to run this test a few times, the Pharazim Nobles could very well come out on top here, and that is something which is true of pretty much all of these, so that is worth bearing in mind as we go forward. Pretty much any of these units I think could have gone on to win the tournament as a whole, and it's much more about RNG this one, and chance as to who makes it through the rounds. But for the time being, at the very least, the favourite for this tournament does go marching into round 2.
foolish general has thrown his life away, and perhaps our chances of victory with it. Oh, dark day. We've been crushed on the field of battle. We have reaped naught but food for the crows.
So next up we actually do have a more interesting fight, in spite of the fact that it is the 2nd seeded Melkor's Chosen against the 7th seeded unit in the Nurad Windblades. It is a far more interesting affair with a far more interesting outcome. Now the reason why the Nurad Windblades, in spite of their multiple HP nature, are the lowest unit on this list is because I always thought of them as being something that was more renowned for their manoeuvrability and their speed across the battlefield. I felt in a more sort of caveman-esque slogfest that this is. Something like the Melkor's Chosen with their heavier nature would be a little bit more well suited for that, but it appears like I was mistaken. I'll let this fight play out for you on the screen without spoiling too much, but this is definitely one of those fights which could have gone either way come the end of it because of how close it ended up being. But yes, the unit that is moving on from this one will be the Nurad Windblades, amazingly enough, but I do urge you to watch through to the end of this fight because it is one of those where really one move in terms of RNG different and the Melkor's Chosen would have won this. But yeah, an interesting outcome this. Maybe the maces weren't really best suited for fighting something which was a little bit more nimble like the Nurads from Khand.
Mightiest Khan, only half of our force remains. Only half the enemy force remains between us and victory. The enemy warlord lies dead. Now his men can sense their doom upon them. Our enemy is dead or fleeing. Our warriors hold the field today.
Moving on then, the third ranked unit, as I put it, were, well, I felt as if it would be the Dwarven unit, so the Erebor Cavalry, the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. Kind of similar to the Melkor's Chosen, I felt, though we see them slightly less. You know, most of the time we see the Dwarves, they obviously lean more into their infantry, and I did feel as though the Ironfoot Hammer Guard were not maybe as good as the Melkor's Chosen, though perhaps I was wrong considering the Melkor's Chosen's elimination in round 1. But yes, the Ironfoot Hammer Guard would be facing off against the Alcarondas Faithful, as you can see here. The human cavalry unit, which I rated lowest, again more so bias against the faction as a whole, in Umbar not being as cavalry focused perhaps as the Warg heavy and melee cavalry heavy Angmar, and Dol Amroth of course, who are much more all-rounders when it comes to their cavalry. And as much as the Alcarondas Faithful do put up a very good fight in this battle, ultimately the hefty damage that comes off of those hammers from the Ironfoot Hammer Guard was too much in the end, and Erebor's cavalry, well, the best cavalry unit they have by far, is going to be moving on to the next round.
Thrown his life away, and perhaps our chances of victory with it. Only half the enemy force remains. My lord, only half our force remains. My lord, the tide of battle seems to have turned against us. We must act and halt this turn of events. preserve us. We have been dealt a stinging defeat today.
Now then, the 4th ranked unit against the 5th ranked unit. The Haven Knights at 4, the Witch Realm Inquisitors at 5. This was something which I wasn't really sure which way around to put these, to be fair, because in my head they're very, very similar units, and that is true. I feel as though if you were to run this test 10 times, you would get a different result every single time you played it, because both of them are very similar. Part of that RNG I was mentioning in the intro as well, where some units don't interact properly with one another. And that seems to have only really been a problem with melee cavalry here. It didn't even happen with lance cavalry in the very first knockout tourney this, but it is what it is. And ultimately the whole point behind these is that RNG should be playing a part. And on this occasion, Dol Amroth have fallen by the wayside. So as much as they were domineering in the lance cavalry tourney with their Arathirim, easily waltzing to victory in the end, surprisingly so, what was traditionally the unit which pretty much everyone brought in the Haven Knights have lost in round 1 here, albeit to a very, very similar unit in the Witch Realm Inquisitors. So the Inquisitors go marching on, and that means there are 3 evil units going into the semi-finals of this one.
Only half the enemy force remains. Only half our force remains.
So to conclude, after round 1, split perfectly down the middle between outcomes that I expected to happen and outcomes that I did not expect to happen, though I would say that the only real surprise for me from round 1 was the Nurad Windblades beating the Melkor's Chosen. I felt like the Witch Realm Inquisitors and the Haven Knights were so close to one another that ultimately it could have gone either way. And indeed, on repeats, after this tournament had taken place and I was wondering how much of a role RNG was really playing in it, in repeat battles, yes, that one really is a coin flip between the Haven Knights and the Witch Realm Inquisitors, but on this occasion, in terms of the first battles, which are all important for this format, Angmar do go marching on into the next round, though they have it all to do in the coming round as they have to deal with the very scary champions of the White Hand. But let's see how they get on with that right now. So, as we head to the slightly earlier semi-final than the other knockout tourneys, we have the champions of the White Hand facing off against the Witch Realm Inquisitors. Going into this fight, I thought much in the same way as round one. I thought the superior damage on the champions of the White Hand would allow them to cleave through a unit which is much more of an all-round kind of thing with, you know, sword and shield, a little bit more of a defensive setup, and certainly more of a defensive setup than the Pharazim Nobles of round one as well. But that wasn't the case, and indeed the all-round nature of the Witch Realm Inquisitors did allow them to overcome the champions of the White Hand on this occasion. So it does go to show that, again, there's a very real chance that RNG is playing a pretty big role in quite a lot of these battles, because you would imagine that the Pharazim Nobles and the Witch Realm Inquisitors would come unstuck against this kind of unit for the same reason. Yet here that's clearly not the case, and the champions of the White Hand do end up falling by the wayside here before making it to the final.
Only half the enemy force remains. Only half our force remains.
And the second of the two semi-finals sees the Ironfoot Hammerguard from Erebor take on the Nurad Windblades of Mordor, which, to be fair, I was kind of surprised that they were able to overcome the Melkor's Chosen in round one. But on this occasion, the hefty nature and perhaps the heftier armour and stats of the Hammerguard, this is one class of unit which I'm even less familiar with the stats than I was for pretty much all of the other knockout tourneys, but it would appear that the Erebor unit here far superior at dealing with these lighter Khandish nomads than the Melkor's Chosen were on their Karagors. So, like them or loathe them, the War Goats will be progressing through to the final, but first we have the small matter of the third place playoff to deal with.
Mightiest Khan, only half of our force remains. Our warlord has fallen. Trust his warriors will avenge him and not despair. Andre, we have been defeated by our enemy. Our honor shamed and disgraced. Our fallen brothers cry out for vengeance.
So the semi-finals are done, and that brings us to the sharp end of this tournament, a little bit faster than we made it in the previous knockout tourneys. Some interesting observations from that one. The champions of the White Hand obviously falling by the wayside to the very impressive so far Witch Realm Inquisitors as they have a shot at the gold medal but the champions of the White Hand, their defensive values may be a little bit too low to see them over the line against units which are capable of withstanding their savage attacks. It is interesting as well to note that the Nurad Windblades were fairly handily defeated by the Ironfoot Hammerguard, and yet this was not the case against the Melkor's Chosen, and I've always thought of the Melkor's Chosen and Ironfoot Hammerguard as filling very, very similar roles. Now RNG does of course play its part in this, as we've said several times in this video already, but it is interesting to note how different the fates of the Nurad Windblades were in those two fights. Their luck did not hold out on this occasion, however, and now they have to go into a third place playoff against the champions of the White Hand to see if they can grab a rather unlikely spot on the podium. So, the third place playoff, and I wasn't actually sure about what this would do, to be fair, because the champions of the White Hand, having already lost to a more defensively savvy unit in the Witch Realm Inquisitors, and the dual-wielding nature and perhaps the lower viability of the more attack-focused and more armour-piercing-focused weaponry that the champions of the White Hand have, as we already saw from the Melkor's Chosen, the Nurad Windblades did quite well against them. So, yeah, I wasn't really sure if the champions of the White Hand would be domineering in this fight against the Candish unit, but in the end, the champions of the White Hand were able to overcome Cand, and I think the base damage on the champions of the White Hand was the thing which saw them over the line here. Perhaps the slightly overly defensive nature of the Melkor's Chosen in round one allowed the Nurad Windblades the opportunity they needed to progress into the latter stages, but ultimately no further will they move on, and indeed they do not place on the podium. Champions of the White Hand, as much as I felt like going into this tournament they would be the ones to watch. They may not go away with the gold medal, but at least they do go away with the bronze.
We have bled the enemy badly. They have only half their men left. Our brash warlord has been slain. May he be judged justly, and our warriors remain steadfast. What fickle fortune we have, to bestow upon us this stinging defeat.
Which brings us on to the grand final, and having seen everything up to this point, I still wasn't sure, in all fairness, which of these two would grab this one. As I've said with these fights before, and it does bear repeating, RNG is definitely playing its part in this unit class more so than in any of the other tournaments we've done so far, I feel. And so if you ran this battle again, I do feel as though it could work out in different ways. I was thinking, with how domineering the Hammerguard were against the Nurad Windblades in the last round, that they would carry the day with superior damage, but that was once again not true. And one of the more generic sword cavalry units, you would say, if a bodyguard unit can be generic, in the Witch Realm Inquisitors, is the unit which is ultimately going to go on to win this tournament. RNG aside, that is fairly impressive for this kind of unit, though it is worth bearing in mind that given the similar nature and very similar stats of some of the other units, if you rearrange the seedings slightly, it's very possible that the Alcarondas Faithful could have done this. It's also very possible that the Haven Knights could have done this. Just my own curiosity following on from this tournament, I ran the Haven Knights versus Witch Realm Inquisitors battle again, and the Haven Knights were the ones to come out on top, so that is worth bearing in mind. It's one of those weird ones, this. It's not a particularly scientific series of tests, this. It's something which I really set up to reminisce really about the more stats focused videos and faction focused videos I did way back when, which I will be starting up with when the new patch comes out again, and hopefully a little bit more a little bit more well formulated than this one. But yeah, at the very least it does go to show that RNG does play its part in battles, and all of those little moments do add up to potentially big changes. But yes, Angmar the victors in this tournament, followed by Erebor with Isengard in third.
Only half our force remains.
So there we have it, the last of these knockout tourneys that I do intend to do. This video format was always a little bit rough and ready, and I feel as though with Sword Cavalry behaving in the way that it did, this was a little bit more of a janky one to run, both in terms of the lower numbers of participants and the way that the units seem to interact with one another mechanically. So yeah, I do feel as though that this series has rather run its course. I mean, archers would be a somewhat interesting one to do, given the different projectiles and the like, but like I said, I would need someone to help me with that, and I feel as though that this series has kind of run its course anyway. By the time this video comes out, we will be getting into March, into the spring of the new year, and as time ticks away, the new patch does get ever closer. So I feel as though these stats-focused videos, these, you know, unit spotlight kind of videos, which this technically falls in the category of, will be replaced by, you know, the ones that I used to do way back when. So we'll be going through some faction overviews and the like once more. But still, this was a fairly fun series for me to do while it lasted, and you know, it at least breaks up the battle replay focus that this channel has gained over the past year or so. Well, more than a year at this point, I suppose. But yeah, the last of the knockout tourneys here finished, and Angmar with the victory as well. So there you have it. As far as what's going to be coming up soon, well, actually, this is the last thing that I'm doing from my backlog as it stands. So I've actually managed to record basically over a month in advance at this point, closing in actually on 2 months in advance, which is good. Gives me a lot more leeway regardless of what may happen in 2023. But yeah, I feel as though there will be more new patch content being dripped in over the course of the next few weeks, because like I said, I do see the more activity around the test builds and things moving forward, which is always encouraging to see. And like I said, the new patch is something which the game sorely needs at this point, so hopefully not too much longer by the time of the release of this video. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little series while it went on. It's actually been ongoing for a fair while at this point, probably the better part of half a year or so. Like I said, it's the sort of thing which I basically just added in every now and then to break up the standard ones. But do let me know in terms of what you would rather see first from this kind of video in the new patch. I feel as though faction overviews will be the thing to start with, and I will go through all of the factions again, starting off with the new ones though, of course. And then if there's any sort of other kind of video you would like to see, then do let me know. Always looking for new feedback and the like, and I do want to start adding a little bit more variety back into the channel and making it not all about battle replays, because that sort of thing can get rather stale. So yeah, feedback is always appreciated, like I said. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.